Welcome back, everybody, to the World Autism Summit, and we are thrilled to have Dr. Chris Bogner with us today. And he stands as an accomplished practitioner in the realm of functional medicine, diligently investigating the underlying triggers of psychiatric disorders. Within the sphere of his practice, he extends his expertise to families grappling with a spectrum of conditions, including autism, anxiety, cognitive disorders, depression, and others. With a solid foundation in the surgical domain of medicine, Dr. Bogner boasts an impressive 22 years tenure in clinical practice, during which he has seamlessly transitioned his focus to the arena of functional medicine. Notably, Dr. Bogner has achieved certification in plant-based nutrition from Cornell University, a testament to his commitment to holistic healthcare. I love holistic healthcare. His involvement in an imminent autism university trial underscores his dedication to advancing knowledge and treatment options in this critical field. A recognized clinical consultant for MaxGen Labs, LLC, a distinguished genetic polymorphism laboratory with global impact, Dr. Bogner's influence is felt among more than 800 practitioners worldwide. He is not only deeply immersed in the scientific exploration of genetics, but also in environmental toxicities, consistently sharing his insights through lectures delivered both within the United States and on his international stage. His philosophy underscores integrative approaches to addressing disease, offering invaluable perspectives on the interplay between genetics and environmental factors. Welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for attending. We love having you here.
Oh, thanks, Karen. I'm very excited and what you're doing. Glad to be part of this and happy to share and answer any questions you have.
Yes, I really am glad you're here. So what has brought you to the World Autism Summit? And I know you have a big picture in what you're doing. I'd like to hear you say what you'd like to share with us.
Well, mostly my interest in autism is stemming from my 18-year-old who was diagnosed at age 2. So I've been immersed in the waters of autism since the last 16 years. And it's not a 9-to-5 job for me. It's a 24/7, Monday to Sunday involvement. I love researching autism over the years. I see patients, I talk to parents every day, even on the weekend. And I've met, I don't know, maybe close to 1,000 families affected by autism. I've spoken on conferences. So I've seen pretty much everything under the sun because I've learned from parents what they have done, not necessarily what was implemented by me. And so I kind of have a good overview of what's out there, what's working, what's not. Do we see patterns? Why does something work for one and not for the other? And yeah, I'm interested to find solutions. I'm trying to find their voice. I'm not satisfied with anything other than finding their voice again. So there are some great breakthroughs, spelling to communicate. I'm sure you know your audience, and that's great. We know they're in there. That's, I think, the most important realization. How are we going to get them to speak? Because I think we know, if you can have a conversation, everything seems to be working great in the brain. So we can bring speech back. I do have patients that have found their voice again. And so if it's possible for them, it's possible for everyone. It's just it's a little bit harder, but it doesn't mean it's not possible. So that's what I do. Yeah, I counsel families. We do virtual meetings, telemedicine. It works out great.
That's great. How do you hope to make the biggest impact in the world in the area that you focus on?
Well, we're looking for a recovery. That's the only achievement that would define success for me. These children are trapped in their body, in their brains, and they have no way to tell us via communication. Their motor sensory system is interfered with, and the intellect is there. We need to free their minds and have them speak with us, let it all out. They're imprisoned in their own body. That doesn't come from me. that comes from individuals who typed this up. I've talked to many very highly intelligent individuals that on the first look, you look at them, you wouldn't think there's any intelligence in there because of the erratic behavior and nonverbal, oftentimes still in diapers, yet they have the ability to communicate, and they're poets. It's divine intelligence beyond what anybody would ever believe. And that's what I believe in. And we need to find a way to help them with their motor sensory integration and with their motor system in the brain. And that's my target, that's my focus. And I think we are pretty close.
That's really, really good. Communication is so important to people, and a lot of people just walk right by people that they think aren't there. They think there's nobody, like they can't communicate, but they're thinking, and there's a lot going on. They just, because they can't speak, that they just don't think that they communicate.
I used to walk through the mall with my son when he was younger, and he was stimming out, and I saw people walking by, either shaking their head or looking the other way, and he was stimming out because he was excited. I knew it, I could feel it, in his face, but it was, maybe disruptive for some, but I used to feel bad for him, that people are looking away or shaking their head. But I came to the point where I actually feel sorry for the person that looked away or was shaking their head, because they don't know. They don't know what of a beautiful person that really is, how much beauty and knowledge these children really have. And so, yeah, I ignore that, and I just, focus on them and talk to them like they're real people. Don't just talk to them in a normal voice. They understand everything, every single word. And I couldn't believe it for myself. My own son spelling to communicate, and he spelled right away. So first session, I cried my eyes out.
Wow.
It was overwhelming, at the age of 18 to witness that. But yeah, it's overwhelming to realize that, and it's a very exciting journey, because again, after so many years of hardships and frustrations and working endlessly with these parents to find solutions, we finally, it seems, we got to a pivotal point where we might engage in an autism revolution, where, as I told you before, I think in a previous discussion, a lot of the information that we receive, and I say we because I have a team of individuals involved, a lot of this information is actually coming from the autism community, from these highly intelligent, nonverbal children. And you wouldn't believe the intelligence. It's beyond savant. It's almost divine intelligence. And they're saying they're connected to God. And it's too vast to imagine the brain power that they truly have. And the information that has transpired, I think, will change everything.
They teach so much patience and resiliency and understanding, and kindness, and people just need to slow down and understand and appreciate people, and people a lot of times are so afraid because they don't understand. They just...
Yeah, the best way to imagine that is that truly you don't feel any different right now, and you would have autism, but yet your body doesn't respond to your commands. I want to move my arm. Well, doesn't work. I want to say something. Nothing happens. Or I'm excited. My body starts doing this, but I don't want to do that. Or I got a little upset and I beat my mom. Well, I don't want to do that, but it happens. And so the body is not controlled with the input from the brain. The motor system is interfered with. And so imagine how you would feel, and how frustrating it must be. And so, yeah, it's that's what we're dealing with, in my opinion. It's a locked-in syndrome. You could almost describe it better, because autism doesn't mean anything, right? It's just a word. Western medicine certainly doesn't explain or explore deep enough of what the origins could be. Take this example. If we have this database for physicians called UpToDate, right? I think it's one of the biggest databases hospitals tap into for their physicians if you quickly want to find out the latest and greatest about a certain condition. What are the studies, what's recommended, what are the dosages, and so forth. If you look at autism, they in the section of autism where they say, what could be done, one of the things is, yes, you can have alternative medicine. It's actually recommended by the CDC. Alternative medicine might be an option, but then they say, well, before you engage in any alternative interventions, make sure you talk to your pediatrician that might not be familiar with alternative medicine. And the pediatricians are guided by their societies, American Academy of Pediatrics, for example. And if you look at the American Academy of Pediatrics in regards to autism, what they say about, biomedical testing, for example, for metabolic disorders or yeast or mold or genetic testing, they say it has absolutely no correlation with autism. There has been no correlation found. But when you look at that little reference that made that statement by that society, you see that these recommendations were published in 1996. So we're talking about 27 years ago. Our current system is basing their beliefs on that there are no correlations with metabolic abnormalities or anything like that with autism, when nothing could be further from the truth. In the last 26 years, we have technologies that have evolved, sequencing and chromatography and genetic testing and more sensitive machines that test for these things, organic acids and metabolic markers, neurotransmitters, all of that. And my God, there's so much more than 1996 that we have now at our fingertips. And to still hold on to these old beliefs is absolutely it's very sad, to say the least, because these children deserve more.
There's a lot of things in this summit that I've realized because I've been sitting in the same chair, listening to every single person. And it's a theme that's, it's like there's a lot of old data that is just being held on to. And it seems like everything should be dated, and be current. It should be like the latest research, it should be like 2003.
I think one of the only things is, the acceptance of functional medicine, to integrate every organ system together. You have a neurologist, he looks at the brain, he doesn't look at the gut, he doesn't look at the microbiome to see if there's dysbiosis, mold, yeast, or, Clostridia overgrowth. He's looking at the brain, and a cardiologist is looking at the heart, and a gastroenterologist looking at the liver and the gut. But I mean, in the last 6 years of having very close communications with families with autism, if they go to a gastroenterologist, and literally the only recommendation that ever came out from a gastroenterologist was Miralax. They have nothing else, and it's insane. Like, why do you even go? You don't. Oh, if you think there's yeast or mold, I need to refer you to an infectious disease specialist. And then you go from specialty to specialty, and you just get pushed around, and nobody has really any clue. So functional medicine is integrating everything. Is how does the gut connect to the brain, the gut-brain connection? What about the liver? What about genetics? What about the immune system? What about toxins from the environment? How does that all play? How do heavy metals, how's lime or mold or yeast or parasites, how do they interact with all of this, depending on what you're equipped with, genetically? And how could you explain and correlate that to the symptoms right now that the patient has? And then you have diet, and so there's so many moving parts. You think the neurologist is gonna explore all this? No, they were trained in medical school. They don't have time. They have 20 patients waiting in the waiting room. They don't have time to listen to you, to explore all that. And that's why functional medicine is so important. I sit down at least for an hour, usually goes a little bit longer. And even that is just oftentimes just scratching the surface, to really find out what is going on with this individual. How can we optimize care? How can we explore things that the pediatrician has never done? What, you've never measured a ferritin level or thyroid markers in this kid? It's like bread and butter, low-hanging fruit. One of the most common neurodevelopmental, development inhibitor is a lack of iron. Why do we give prenatal vitamins to a woman? Because of iron. It's the main ingredients, iron requirements. Iron is carrying oxygen. We need iron. Iron is important to break down certain neurotransmitters. If you don't have it, why can't you check it? There's so many kids I checked that never had a ferritin or iron check. That's insane. Even if they have conditions like autism, it's like, why don't you throw a big net at these kids and see what you can catch, in regards to abnormalities, at least with blood work. I'm not even talking about, more specialized testing like genetics. I don't expect every pediatrician to be an expert in this, but to then say, oh, this is quackery, or this has not been proven, there's no evidence, that's a defense mechanism by these individuals, because they're kind of intimidated by this, because could potentially dip into their.
So as an MD with expertise in autism and neurodiversity, what do you see as the biggest need in biomedical interventions today?
I think the biggest need is really that we need to spend time with the parents. The parents know their children the best. We think that we can just order labs and figure it out. No, we need to listen to the parents. Every child is so different, autism is a big umbrella. I have children that bang their heads at 2 a.m. in a bathtub screaming, and I have kids that play the piano, yet they're socially awkward and they have the same diagnosis. So what makes that difference? And so we need to explore, see what is the problem, where the issues, how did this come about? Did your child, was your child born like this, or did they regress after a certain event? In my practice, I'm not lying. 95% of parents I've talked to over the last 16 years say there was a vaccine involved. So I truly believe that. I mean, what am I going to believe 1,000 parents where 95% say that a vaccine they believe caused changes in their child shortly after they received it? Or do I believe the randomized controlled trials that the government has given us showing no correlation at all and they're absolutely safe? I'm going to believe the parent, because they give birth to their child. They spend every minute with their child of their life. Are they lying? Are they wrong? No, I don't think so. And so that's why we need to listen to the parents. What are your concerns? What do you think is going on? Nobody asked them that question. What do you think is going on? And usually they're on the right path. They have a right intuitive mind. And if they don't know, sure, let's explore together. But under the guidance of the parent knows the child the best. And I learned from the parent. And that's why we need to listen more to the person that gave birth to that child, or that caregiver of that individual that knows them best. And then take the symptoms in. What are the symptoms? Because if you get a genetic test, for example, you can have bad looking genes, but you can be a healthy individual if you take good care of yourself with nutrition and exercise and all of that. And you can have very good looking genes, but if you have a bad diet and a sedentary lifestyle, you can be miserable. And so we need to correlate the genes to the symptoms, and of course with the other laboratory markers, and then merge them together to find the best solution for the individual. And that's just the core in regards to the genetics, to supply your genes with the nutrients they need to express themselves. But there are other nefarious factors involved that we have, that we're exploring, that are, I would have told you, if you would have told me that 6 months ago, I would have said this is absolutely insane. But I believe there are some toxins involved that you might have not, correlated with autism before. But we are currently exploring, and it could be really a root of it all. So
what is that again?
I think it is very much the root of the origins of autism.
Very interesting. Okay. And so you're just finding those things out about now.
Yeah. Like I said, paradoxically, with the help of the autism community. So I have 2 individual boys, 1 9, 1 15, both nonverbal, but both able to communicate. And both of these boys have transmitted information that, seem to correlate really well with what I've been researching over the years. It was like this big puzzle piece that was missing, and it fit. And all of a sudden you see the whole picture and you're like, wow, that is truly remarkable. And, having this knowledge and seeing this picture, now you can apply interventions and you start to see the positive outcomes. It's nothing is more satisfying, and that's why now I'm at the stage where, I talk to many different research colleagues in academia, working at the universities, like Brian Hooker, who is, at Children's Health Defense. He's the chief science officer there for that group, and he had a discussion with this boy that transmitted this information with that family. He was so fascinated that he said, "Hey, we got to study this and show it." So the next step forward is, it's not just my words. We want to prove it. We want to prove it, and we want to show it on paper to, convince even the naysayers that say this is quackery, or this is not applicable, or this is wrong. And so that's how we move forward, step by step. It's difficult, of course, funding and
Right.
all of that, but we're doing it. We're applying for the IRB right now, and we have the study design done, and we're gonna study about 60 children, and it's placebo-controlled, double-blinded, and it's going to be done in California, and we're excited, and we'll see what happens.
That's really, really good. It's always good to do the double-blind studies just to really, really test things out. So I know we were talking a while ago about, whether or not people would be able to think directly, like if a person has autism and they can't really get their words out, and they really do have a stomach problem or have an issue that they can't explain, and they have everybody around them, their whole support team, talking about what's going on for them. So you can't really get the straight goods from a person with autism. If there was a way that we could find out what's really going on, it would be a lot better. Have you found any way that you can really communicate and get better results?
Yeah, and so that's all based on a theory, and it's a theory. I'm not saying it's the absolute truth, but I yet have to find somebody that disproves it. And I'm gonna, mention it to you, and I want to maybe share a picture or two to explain this. It's fairly complex, but I give it to you in a nutshell. So what we believe is one of the root causes of autism is actually chronic cyanide poisoning. Cyanide, as you know, is a carbon and nitrogen atom. It's highly toxic to humans, and most of us know about cyanide from suicide, industrial accidents, or the most common reason, for example, in the United States, is house fires. You always get toxic with carbon monoxide and cyanide. When you burn victim, you go to the ER, they check carbon monoxide and cyanide levels. Depending on which one is more severe, you have different therapeutic interventions for each. But cyanide poisoning is common in the United States, and the question is, could there be cyanide elsewhere? Where would it be coming from? And as you know, cyanide, we can have inhalation toxicity, dermal absorption, and oral. But where could we be possibly exposed to cyanide in children? And so there are three major categories of where cyanide exposure could occur. One is our diet. So, to give you a little background, our crops in this country, we're talking about corn, soy, sugar beets, wheat, barley, oats, are amongst the most heavily contaminated crops on this planet, along with China and India. In fact, the United States is considered at extreme risk for mold contamination of our crops, so much that about 92% of corn in this country is contaminated with more than one mold toxin. And mold toxins are highly toxic because you only need a tiny amount to exhibit toxicity. So the interesting part is, though, that when we appreciate the fact that so much of our crops is infested with mold, things like aspergillus, and then knowing that aspergillus is able to produce cyanide as a metabolic byproduct, and knowing that it is not routine practice in the United States to check crops for cyanide, well, that is certainly a very big concern, that we could have excess cyanide in our diet. The CDC mentions, for example, that 0.05 parts per million particles of cyanide will cause toxicity in your body. And so are we sure that this is not the case in just, our corn chips or, not enough to kill you, obviously, but enough to exhibit whatever cyanide is doing. And I will explain that in a second. But there are other products that contain cyanide, lima beans, almonds, apricot kernels, flax seeds, peach kernels, Lindt truffles, dark chocolate, bamboo shot, soybeans, lentils, millets, and like I mentioned, browns. So those all potentially contain, and cassava is a big one, probably the biggest. Don't do cassava.
What is that again? Cassava?
Yeah, it's a flour.
Wow.
The other origins, however, are a little bit more concerning. So we have endogenous production of cyanide. So like I mentioned, the Aspergillus mold. We have bacteria as a metabolic byproduct that are able to produce cyanide, such as Klebsiella and Pseudomonas. And we have certain yeasts that can produce cyanide. Parasites, nematodes can produce cyanide. And believe it or not, our brain can generate cyanide from scratch. Especially, there are studies that show that when the brain is stimulated via opioid receptors, by opioids, it can produce cyanide. And if you just really think about that, why somebody's taking opioids, they're in a state of bliss and worry-free, and they feel it's addictive, probably because of what cyanide does. It decreases oxygenations of certain parts of the brain and shuts down certain areas of the brain. And for some people, that's, preferable. So that's how I think that works. But yeah, the brain can produce cyanide itself with opioids. And you think about the casein issue in autism. Casein, from dairy products, if it slips into the blood because you have an inflamed gut and a leaky gut and you have it in the blood, it forms casomorphine. And casomorphine is then activating opioid receptors, which would explain why certain children have a higher pain tolerance, for example, but certainly could also explain why we have improvement with the cessation of dairy in a lot of children. And then, of course, we have one more source, and that is vaccines. And I say this boldly because, there were whistleblowers. Mark Livingston, if anybody wants to look that up, as a whistleblower from Wyeth. And, Wyeth was involved with the Prevnar vaccine. And, it was known that in that pharmaceutical company that nobody wanted to work in that department producing Prevnar because they use cyanide in the production of the vaccine. The MMR vaccine in the manufacturing process is utilizing cyanide. When you grow the viruses, the MMR viruses, in the human diploid cells, which is sick by itself, but when you grow them in the human cells and you want to extract them after they have matured, you use cyanide. And so there are potentially traces in MMR vaccine of cyanide. If you look at the package insert of hepatitis B, you can see that it clearly says on there, this vaccine may contain traces of formaldehyde and potassium thiocyanate, which are used during the manufacturing process. See section 4.3, 4.4, blah, blah, blah. So it's certainly not a conspiracy. How do we know? Anybody tested it? I certainly would be happy if somebody would test for cyanide in all of our vaccines and come up with less than 0.05 parts per million. I'd be happy, but guess what? It hasn't been done yet. So this theory has not been disproven. So with all of these sources of cyanide, the EPA says, well, the food doesn't contain enough cyanide. It's not enough to cause disease in humans. Yet the CDC contradicts that and says, well, you better make sure it's not more than 0.05 parts per million. But what about the mechanisms that we have built in us to deal with cyanide? What if you're one of those individuals that potentially don't have the ability to utilize these detoxification pathways that are designed in our body to deal with cyanide? And there are two major pathways that we have to deal with it. So let's assume you consume cyanide, small amount, not enough to kill you, let's say, or enough to kill you, whatever. What's the first pass? So it's the liver, right? Anything from the gut gets absorbed and has to go through the liver first. So the cyanide arrives at the liver, and then the liver is like, well, hell no, I'm going to get rid of you. And there are two mechanisms that do that. The first is sulfation, sulfur. Sodium thiosulfate is one of the antidotes that's approved since 1939 by the FDA for cyanide poisoning. And sodium thiosulfate is simply salt and sulfur. Remember, sulfur is required for detoxification in humans, but we cannot produce it. So we need outside sources, such as eggs, garlic, and onions or cruciferous vegetables. But because our kids don't eat these things, plus they have issues converting that type of sulfur in those foods into the form that can be used to detoxify cyanide, which is done by a gene called sulfide oxidase, which oftentimes I see, compromised in these children, but in addition is inhibited by arsenic and tungsten and glyphosate. I mean, just look at Stephanie Seneff's research over the last 10 years. Glyphosate inhibits sulfation. And so we have the inability of a lot of individuals to already, produce that type of sulfur that's required to detoxify cyanide. And so that's a major pathway that we have. The other pathway is in fact, B12 called hydroxycobalamin. Hydroxycobalamin is the B12 type that's the most abundant in our body. About 70% is stored in our liver, and that's the type of B12 that you get actually from your diet, from red meat and green leafy vegetables. The B12 contained in red meat is hydroxycobalamin. And remember, that is the storage form of B12. And like I said, mostly in the liver. It can form methyl B12, which is used for methylation. It can form adenine B12 used in mitochondria. But hydroxy B12 also directly binds to cyanide. And what it forms is cyanocobalamin. Cyanocobalamin then gets excreted. And the thing with it is, what's interesting, I find that if you have an individual with autism and you measure their B12 level, historically, I always seen, oh my God, I have these sky-high levels of B12. But what are we actually measuring in the blood? What type of B12 are we measuring? Is it all together? Is it cyano, adeno, methyl, or hydroxy? It is cyanocobalamin that we measure in the blood. So we're measuring the hydroxycobalamin plus cyanide, which forms cyanocobalamin. That's what we measure in the blood. And why would it be high? Well, it's maybe because you have high cyanide, and maybe you have sulfation issues. That pathway is not working because you have sulfation issues, which we know are occurring in autism based on studies. And so the body then is fully dependent on the B12 resources, which you tap into the hydroxy, you have little left for methyl production or adeno production, which if you have methylation, MTHFR, MTRR variations, you have methylation issues. Why is methylation important? Because that neutralizes histamine and adrenaline. And so you can start to see how this is really the source of a lot of issues that this toxin does. And we need these pathways open. Now, what happens really on a molecular level, and just really quick to wrap this up, cyanide enters the cell and it goes to the mitochondria. Remember, we have thousands of mitochondria within each cell, right? It's the motors in the cell that produce energy, ATP. And in order for this mitochondria to produce ATP, it requires oxygen. It's a process within the mitochondria called oxidative phosphorylation. You keep adding phosphate, and you eventually produce ATP. What is ATP good for? ATP keeps the cell alive. It's required for DNA expression. DNA expression does what? It produces new cells. It produces protein, enzymes, our defenses. And so we need ATP, lots of it. And oxygen is the driving force. Well, cyanide comes in and it throws a wrench into the mitochondria. It inhibits this enzyme called cytochrome C. It's one of the last enzymes before this ATP can be produced. And so what happens? The oxygen starts building up behind, it can't push through because of the cyanide. And what happens? All of the electrons start to saturate the oxygen. And now you have what we call O2 minus. It's what we call reactive oxygen species. It's a superoxide. And that now leaves the cell and it goes to our red blood cells and it chops off the iron of hemoglobin. And, hemoglobin, remember, you have 4 units, and 2 subunits of these alpha and beta chains that carry oxygen. And so it chops off an iron ion, this superoxide, leaving the red blood cell with, instead of Fe3+, it's now Fe2+, which is ferric iron. and ferric iron is unable to carry oxygen. And so you have these red blood cells floating around and they cannot bind oxygen. And that's why we see less oxygenation of the brain. You know, we have studies that show children affected with autism have areas in the brain that have received less oxygen, such as the cerebellum and the temporal lobes. You know, the cerebellum is coordinating behavior and speech and behavior, and the temporal lobes are responsible mostly for short-term memory and speech. And so the motor neurons are affected first. You know, if you have severe cyanide toxicity and you start walking down a fine line, first you get dizzy, you know, it's because your motor system is shutting down, and then you die. But in chronic toxicity, these motor neurons are very sensitive to cyanide toxicity. And that's why I believe the motor sensory system is shut down because of you know, the decreased oxygenation because of cyanide. And that's why things like hyperbaric oxygen do not show really a true effect. Why? Because the mitochondria cannot use oxygen. And so oxygen is not the solution for this problem. The solution is to strengthen your liver to detoxify the cyanide. And to do so, we need two ingredients, and that's hydroxycobalamin and sodium thiosulfate. And you know, that's a beginning, you know, to bring the cyanide levels down. There's much more that needs to be done. You know, we need to address the blood-brain barrier, which has been disrupted, and the inflammation that occurs still. The other problem is, you know, that iron that was chopped off the red blood cell, you know, that ferric iron, it's toxic. It's not as toxic as cyanide, but that iron is binding the cyanide very strongly to form cyanomethemoglobin, and that then with sodium thiosulfate forms into thiocyanate, which then we get rid of. But that iron is, you know, even if we reduce the cyanide, is still floating around. It doesn't automatically go back to the red blood cell and, you know, kumbaya, it can carry oxygen again. We can help with that process. And then, you know, there's a substance you might have heard of, it's called methylene blue, that in patients that have methemoglobinemia, and we give IV methylene blue to reattach the iron to the red blood cell so it can do that again. Because remember, a red blood cell lives 120 days, you know, and so we can chop off the iron, but we can reattach it too. So at the right time, methylene blue might be a consideration for individuals that have reduced their cyanide levels to, you know, then bring more oxygen to the brain again. And so those are the kind of principles that we work a lot with genetics, you know, to see how can we support, you know, the binding of toxins to glutathione, how can we regenerate glutathione, and which minerals do you need. All that is based on the individual, you know, when we see the genetic variations. And the beauty of it is, you know, we can see those genes that maybe work a little bit slower in everyone, and we can signal them. You know, we can signal them with minerals, vitamins, and nutrients, and they respond. You know, that's what makes a vitamin a vitamin. They signal genes. So, and so that is the basis of it, and we see great results. For the first time in 16 years, I see speech coming back in individuals, behavior is better, the awareness is better, and yeah, that's what we want to study it.
That's really good. Now I feel like a doctor.
You're smarter than a doctor, Karen. Just remember that.
No.
Doctors are not smart. I'm sorry. I tell you, that's a firm statement. I'm so disappointed in everything. I've talked to so many. They don't know nothing. They follow a protocol from the pharma industry. I probably will have a lot of.
I got another question to ask you though, but so I was going to ask you though, like speaking about nutrition and vitamins and things like that. Do you have, like, if you were to say, create like three different types of areas that you would focus on, like for getting vitamins and minerals and nutrition, you know, I know you can't just say a blanket statement of a type of vitamin nutrition that you would, you know, build in for people with autism and neurodiversity that you would start them on, but would you have like a certain area that you would focus them on? What would you do if you were to do something like that?
Yeah, so you know, one of the issues is when how can we don't have, when we have cyanide, if we would have chronic cyanide poisoning, how could we not have necrosis and tissue dying? A lot of this has to do that, the cells have secondary mechanisms to produce this energy, the ATP. So a cell can produce energy without oxygen. But, unfortunately, the byproduct of that, of producing energy without oxygen, is the production of lactic acid. Mm-hmm. So when we consider that a lot of cyanide exposure occurs in the gut, and the glyphosate and all of these chemicals that cause inflammation, we also see a lot of lactic acid production in that area, which is, again, the breeding ground for more bacterial overgrowth and, yeast and all of these things, and the whole cycle keeps going. But and so one of the important supplements that I would look at is to support our microbiome. My colleague Alex Zakaris that I work with, he's brilliant. What he's doing what we call 16S microbiome balancing. What that is, it's a technology that is like a 23andMe test for your microbiome. It checks every single bacteria on a sequencer. We check the RNA, and it plots the level of distribution of all bacteria in a percentage. And you can see, which one is low, which one is high. Yeah. And there are thousands of bacteria, as you know, and you can start to see patterns. And then you have scientific papers that discuss what are the consequences of having 60% instead of 2% of Prevotella overgrowth or Clostridium. And then you look at the scientific literature, and there are so much research that what you can do about it. You can give different fibers, different prebiotics, different probiotics. And so Alex has analyzed over 1,000 stool samples for patients and made recommendations and followed them clinically. So he has a good idea of what works, what doesn't. And so we're, kind of looking at, because it's a very extensive process, the recommendations requires a lot to develop something that targets the microbiome. So that would be the first and foremost. To support the microbiome. Our defense is right there. It's the first exposure is the gut, right? All other organs depend on what the gut is doing. The only organ that doesn't depend on any other organ is the gut. Mm-hmm. It depends on what you are doing, with your conscious mind, what you put in your mouth. And so the gut is really where it starts. And then, of course, there are, vitamins and minerals that are very essential, some B vitamins, but in the right dose, and which B vitamin, is it B6? Is it the natural form? Is it the pyridoxine hydrochloride, or is it the pyridoxine 5-phosphate? If so, what is the ratio? Which one? And you do that with every single one. There are no shortcuts, not too much, not too little. Consider, these are children. Don't go with the 10,000% of methylfolate. It's insanity. It's not helpful. It will backfire, guaranteed. I've never seen this work chronically, that you give these high amounts to these kids. And then have repair compounds in there, like glutamine and creatine, for example. These are very important. And so that would be the second one. Then the third one would be to develop something to have the kids go poop. So we're in the process of that as well. Constipation is our worst enemy. You start to engage in the right protocols, but the body starts to detox, and a lot of toxins are dumped through the biliary system into the gut. The gut is like, that's too much. I'm not going to work anymore. And you have constipation, recirculates everything, and then you have detox symptoms. So a pooping supplement is very important. I think there's some great remedies, but again, you're going to buy 6-7 different ones, or you're going to have one supplement that really works, for this population. And so those will be the first 3. There are others. There are, such great things with, herbs and even homeopathy, cell salts. I've engaged in that. Cell salts are absolutely incredible. The study is almost 100 years old, even longer, I think. Cell salts, and also maybe in the realms of the cannabinoids and terpene world. There's a lot of research into CBG, CBD, and CBN, along with the THC. Obviously, you can't produce THC, but a full plant cannabis kind of extract without the THC in the legal realms. I've done a lot of research in those areas, very helpful for a lot of families. Yeah, and then you just keep going,
Yeah.
they're probably,
I'm just thinking, like, for all the families that don't have a lot of money, that, can get their kids on the right track, something easy, simple, and, affordable.
yeah.
It just doesn't have to be rocket science.
And coming from someone that knows, I'm a father, and I'm not sitting behind a desk at the CDC or at the university, not having exposure to patients. I've seen over the years so many supplements. I mean, I have probably 100 bottles here standing myself. So you kind of start to know, 30 milligrams of P5P of the B6 is too much. The kids go bananas, but 5 milligrams, what's needed. And so the dosage matters as well. And more is not always better. In fact, the opposite is true. Go slow and go low. So that's the kind of mantra that you have to follow. Because if you give something every day that has 400-500% of, and you think, oh yeah, that will do it. Well, guess what? Your receptors will start down regulating, and you need to let them breathe. Sometimes you need to give them a break over the weekend to let the receptors re-express themselves. So there's a lot along with this. You don't want to overdo it either. Some say any excess vitamins get excreted, but no, you have to be careful. And that's why a lot of parents say, oh, initially it worked great, but then all of a sudden it didn't. And that has to do with the receptor expression. It's the same effect of glutamate. A lot of people say, well, what about glutamate? Should I avoid it? I'm like, hell, no, you don't avoid glutamate. It's required for neurons to fire. But why is glutamate a problem in the brain? It's because, not because we take too much, it's because we don't absorb it, in between the synapses. The cell, the astrocyte, doesn't absorb it. And so what happens? There's so much glutamate, it causes toxicity. So what does the body do? It stops producing the receptors for glutamate. So despite having too much glutamate, we actually have low glutaminergic tone in the brain. And that's what fires motor neurons, is glutamate. And so you don't want to block them. Some practitioners block the glutamate receptors with these Alzheimer drugs. It's not the right solution. We need glutamate, but make sure you absorb it and process it. And it's all a cycle. You need to keep that spinning. Don't let anything accumulate and create toxicity, and it will cause deficiency on the other side. So you need to make sure you're looking at those pathways. What causes glutamate absorption in the astrocyte is sodium channels.
It's a very delicate balance, I know.
There's delicate balance, and so that's why I think, it's not the enemy, glutamate.
But I know there's a lot of fillers and a lot of over-the-counter vitamins too that I've heard, right? A lot of
and your friend Lindsay is an expert on that. We're trying to stay as natural as possible with as little other ingredients as possible. Of course, I had a patient the other day. She said, "Hey, I'm worried about the gelatin." I'm like, "Why?" Because it's derived from pigs. And my religion forbids, the use of pigs. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had no idea, that this is actually an issue. And I'm like, oh, let's find something different. And so you have to be careful, with a lot of these other ingredients. There are, polysorbate 80, and what are some of the other ones that Lindsay mentioned the other day? Again, I'm trying to stay with as little other ingredients as possible. Certainly no, canola or soy. If any supplement, no matter how good it looks, if it has soy or canola in it, throw it in the garbage. It's a good toilet. Don't take them. Very bad. At least in my opinion. Might have worked for other people, so all respect to you, but I don't want to appear arrogant in any way, and be all-knowing, but it's just the things that I avoid personally. So.
Well, that's really, really helpful information. So you've got a wealth of information. Thank you so much.
I hope so. If anybody wants to contact me, or always available for answer any questions or consult with you.
Yes.
We do have a lotion available for sodium thiosulfate for general support. We're not claiming that it cures or treats any disease, but it's for support of your current regimen. to provide some sulfur to the body for various benefits, potential benefits. So it's been working pretty well. So
let everybody know how they can get in touch with you.
My website for consultations for my clinic is drbognerhealth.com, and my other company is called Thiogenics. It's THIOGENICS.com. So yeah, I'm happy to help where help is needed.